Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine landscapes you thought you knew. Vast, flat-topped mountains, towering stone columns, or a desert stretching out endlessly.
Mm-hmm. Familiar sights.
What if the ground beneath your feet, the very mountains and plains, weren't quite what conventional geology tells us?
Well, we're diving into some source material today that presents a truly unconventional theory.
Yeah.
Very unconventional.
Right.
It suggests that perhaps Earth's most familiar geological features aren't just the result of natural processes over millions of years, but something radically different, maybe even engineered.
Exactly. So our deep dive is into this exploration of a single compelling idea. It links together formations like mesas, deserts, canyons,
Bible big ones.
proposing they are something else entirely. So our mission is to walk through this theory point by point, as it's laid out in the source material you've shared,
Yep.
and see how it asks us and asks you, the listener, to look at the world from a profoundly different perspective.
Okay, so the core claim, right at the heart of this material, it's pretty audacious, you could say. Go on. What if those iconic flat-topped mesas? What if they aren't simply eroded layers of rock? What if they're actually the remnants of giant tree stumps?
Whoa. Okay. Giant tree stumps.
Yeah.
So it takes that visual similarity because, they do look a bit like stumps and expands it dramatically.
Hugely. Suggesting that much of the Earth's current landscape, the mountains, the deserts, the quarries, the canyons, are actually the remains or the debris or maybe even the mining sites
From these.
associated with these colossal ancient trees.
Yeah. The scale implied by this theory, it's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It really is. If something like Devil's Tower, that famous formation, if that's interpreted as a tree stump,
Which visually you can kind of see it.
you can. And the source calculates these would have been trees reaching thousands of feet, maybe even miles into the sky.
Miles high. Okay. And the source even delves into who might have been involved in something like this, a transformation that big.
It does. It suggests ancient beings, maybe giants or figures like the Nephilim, from ancient texts,
Right.
possibly involved in terraforming the planet or exploiting its resources on just an unimaginable scale.
Okay, so quite a claim. How does the source actually build this case? Where does it start?
So it starts by revisiting some fundamental concepts, but framing them specifically for its theory, almost redefining them in a way.
Okay, like what?
Well, it lays the groundwork by defining soil, not just as loose earth, but almost poetically as the skin of the planet where vegetation grows.
The skin. Interesting phrasing.
Yeah, and it touches on the basic types of rock, igneous, sedimentary, metamorphic, familiar geological terms,
Standard stuff.
but it sets them up as the building blocks that might be something else under this new lens.
Yeah.
Like maybe they're not all naturally formed rock.
Gotcha. Setting the stage. And
Yeah.
sand.
And sand, yeah. That's stuff you find everywhere. Deserts, rivers, beaches, described simply as broken down granules of rock. These are the core materials the source then, re-examines.
Through its alternative theory.
Exactly.
Okay, so applying those concepts, where does it go first? Mesas and mountains.
Right away. It turns its attention straight to mesas and mountains, arguing they bear the visual hallmarks of, ancient tree remains.
It really leans heavily on that visual argument then. Mesas looking like massive stumps with flat tops.
Yep.
And mountains appearing like gigantic trees just snapped off at the base.
Precisely. And what specific examples does the source highlight here? You mentioned Devil's Tower.
Devil's Tower is the key example used repeatedly. It points to its immense size, its unique, isolated structure in that landscape,
It really stands out.
and its distinct shape, arguing it resembles what it calls a tree stone, essentially a stone formation that looks like a tree stump.
A tree stump, okay?
And the source does some fascinating hypothetical math based on that idea.
What does it come up with?
It estimates that if Devil's Tower were a tree, it would have been over 19,000 feet tall,
19,000 feet.
with a base circumference exceeding a mile. When you think about the actual size of Devil's Tower, it's huge, but that scale is just...
It makes you pause, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the source contrasts this scale with the largest known living trees, like California sequoias.
Right, like General Sherman. Big tree, but...
Yeah, the General Sherman tree, it's over 2,700 years old, has a 25-foot base, and it's about 275 feet tall. Impressive, but...
Nothing like 19,000 feet.
Exactly. So the source asks the question, if trees can live for millennia and reach this size, what happened to potentially even older, even larger ones? These mesas, it posits, they look like they were simply cut down.
Cut down. Wow. Okay. So Moving from these solid towering structures,
Yep.
the source then shifts its focus to something more granular, deserts.
Right. Sand.
And it asks a really unconventional question about where they came from.
Yeah, it probes whether all deserts are purely natural formations just from erosion over time. Is that the whole story?
And it makes an interesting observation, doesn't it, about the amount of sand.
It does. It notes that in many desert areas, there just seems to be significantly more sand than you can easily explain by the visible nearby eroded rock.
Hmm. So where did it come from?
Well, this leads it to suggest the sand wasn't just naturally deposited by wind and water, but perhaps deliberately dumped there.
Dumped. Like landfill.
Sort of. The source even floats the idea of examining a world map, suggesting that if you were to piece the continents back together, like Pangaea, the major deserts could potentially align into one enormous area, which, again, questions a purely natural, localized origin for all of them.
Okay. So how might these vast sand deposits have formed, according to the source? It gives possibilities.
It proposes two main possibilities. One is the aftermath of a truly massive meteor impact.
Okay, like a global catastrophe.
Yeah, pointing to huge craters like the one under the Gulf of Mexico, suggesting the surrounding deserts could be the impact debris, basically.
That would explain a lot of material being moved.
It would. But acknowledging that this explanation doesn't easily cover all major deserts, the source leans into its core theory, raising the provocative second possibility, that the sheer volume of desert sand was physically deposited there, dumped by ancient beings,
As waste or...
possibly as waste, which leads us neatly to the next point. Quarries and canyons.
Okay. How do they fit in?
Well, the source defines a quarry pretty straightforwardly. A man-made excavation site, usually for mining stone or minerals.
Standard definition.
But here's where it makes a controversial connection. It argues that the appearance of quarry walls, the stepped look, the sheer faces, often resembles that of natural mountain ranges and canyons.
Okay, I can see that visual similarity sometimes, the terraces.
Exactly. And this visual similarity leads the source to a really bold hypothesis.
Which is?
That formations like the Grand Canyon, maybe they aren't primarily the result of millions of years of the Colorado River eroding down.
What then?
What if they could be interpreted as, and this is a direct quote, just a long hole, left behind by massive ancient mining operations?
The Grand Canyon as a mine, that's a big leap from river erosion.
It's a huge leap. But then it connects this back to the desert idea, using simple logic.
Yeah.
When you dig a hole that big,
You gotta put the dirt somewhere.
you have to put the excavated material somewhere. And it suggests that the vast deserts could be the dumping grounds, the spoil heaps, essentially, from this massive mining activity.
Wow. So canyons as mines, deserts as the waste dumps.
That's the connection it makes. And it offers a particularly striking analogy to drive this point home,
Oh.
suggesting that even something like a volcano could potentially be seen in a new light. Not just geological activity, but maybe nothing more than a large burning landfill from these ancient operations.
A burning landfill. Goodness. Okay.
So you see how the source is weaving these ideas together. Mountains and mesas as potential tree remnants,
Tree stumps, yeah.
canyons and quarries as possible mining sites, and deserts as resulting waste deposits. It's building a whole alternative picture.
Okay. Is there other evidence? You mentioned patterns earlier.
Ah, yes. A crucial visual piece of evidence the source highlights to support this whole theory are the widespread hexagonal patterns observed in rocks across the globe.
Hexagonal.
Like honeycombs.
Exactly like honeycombs. Six-sided columns or patterns.
Where do you see those?
Well, it presents the theory that these striking patterns are not simply, random geological formations from cooling lava or something,
Where?
but are the visible cross-sections of the internal fibers of these ancient giant tree stumps. Like looking at the cellular structure, but fossilized in rock.
Okay, that's specific. What examples does it use?
It points to really famous examples, like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, those perfect hexagonal columns.
Yeah, incredible place.
And it asks, were those carved by the elements, or were they somehow grown? It notes similar patterns, maybe less famous, in places like the Salt Flats of Bolivia, not claiming they are stumps, mind you, just noting the recurring pattern.
Also Bell Rock in Arizona. And then it just lists finding these hexagonal structures in numerous countries worldwide: Russia, Ethiopia, Venezuela, Canada, Italy, Argentina, Australia, South Africa, across the U.S.
So it's saying this pattern is global.
It stresses that these patterns are global and they're sitting in plain sight. It sees them as strong evidence for this petrified giant tree idea.
Okay, so if we accept this premise for a moment, giant trees, cut down, mined, it leads to some big questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This comprehensive view of the landscape prompts the source to ask those critical questions. Like, if these trees were cut down on such a massive scale, where are the rest of the tree parts?
Right? The trunks, the branches, you'd expect enormous amounts of debris.
Exactly. And maybe even more fundamentally, where is the unimaginable machinery or the tools you would need for a task like that? Cutting down mile-high trees.
Yeah, you'd need something pretty advanced or just huge.
Huge. So the source offers its theory on this, too. It proposes that these gigantic trees were cut, then possibly mined for resources, and ultimately maybe burned, destroyed.
Burned, leading to.
Well, it suggests that the rocky remains, the debris from these massive trunks and branches, that's what makes up the rocks and stones we see everywhere today.
So mountains aren't just uplifted rock, they're petrified wood debris.
That's the implication. And perhaps even that this material contributes to formations like the polar ice caps, though it doesn't elaborate much on the ice caps part.
Wow. Okay. The sheer scale is something else.
It's genuinely challenging not to pause, as the source encourages you to, and just try to imagine what the world must have looked like when these immense biological structures stood.
If they stood.
If they stood, yes. The source's final thought on this section is quite poetic, actually.
Yeah.
It says that looking at mountains and mesas, they truly look like they were grown instead of molded by slower geological processes.
Grown instead of molded. That's a powerful image.
It is. So bringing all these threads together, the interpretation of mesas and mountains as giant tree remnants.
Stumps and broken bases.
The controversial view of deserts and canyons as ancient mining waste and excavation sites.
The holes in the dumps.
And these widespread hexagonal rock patterns seen as like fossilized tree fibers.
Internal structure.
The source constructs this grand, unified theory. It's trying to explain the fundamental landscape of the Earth in a completely different way.
And what's the overall picture it paints?
It paints a picture of Earth as having potentially been deliberately transformed, maybe terraformed, ending up as what it calls a terraformed gigantic desert wasteland compared to whatever its original state might have been.
Oh, wasteland. That's pretty bleak.
Yeah, with much of its current surface material being the sheer debris from these ancient, destroyed giant trees.
It's undeniably a provocative way to view the planet we live on, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, this deep dive has focused on exploring this specific viewpoint, this theory, as presented in the source material you shared.
Right, we're unpacking their argument.
Exactly. Offering this radically different lens through which to see some of the most familiar landscapes on Earth.
Absolutely. And it forces you, or at least it forced me, to reconsider things you thought were just settled facts. Bedrock geology, you know. If geological features that seem so permanent and understandable could potentially be interpreted so differently based purely on the visual evidence the source highlights. What does that suggest?
Well, what does that suggest about how we truly understand Earth's deep history? And maybe what other surprising perspectives might be waiting to be discovered? Perhaps, like the source says, hidden in plain sight. Makes you wonder.
It certainly does. Something for you, the listener, to mull over.